Hello out there. Welcome, people. We're going to start a session in just a little bit here that we welcome you to bring your lunch into the center of the Inclusive Finance Pavilion. We want to talk about creating a community of practice for financial institutions investing in Africa and African landscapes. So if that sounds like something of interest, please do. Don't be afraid to bring your lunch. Come on in. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Be really excellent. Thanks. Okay, I'm just going to get started covering the thing that I'm going to talk about, and then that way, hopefully my voice will lure some people in to hear the really interesting stuff that Caroline von Leenders is going to talk about in just a moment. So I want to start this session about creating a community of practice for investors in African landscapes by talking a little bit about something called the African Landscapes Action Plan, which we being Eco-Agriculture Partners as the Secretariat for the Landscapes for People, Food and Nature Initiative, the organizations that I represent, helped facilitate the creation of that in 2014 at a conference in Nairobi with about 200 leaders from African landscapes and international donor institutions and national governments across Africa came together and in a participatory, collaborative way over 4 days, produced a document that's called the African Landscapes Action Plan that's got 18 priority actions for supporting sustainable land and water management in African landscapes. And the government of the Netherlands generously supported the development of that action plan, and then also supported ongoing work by the Landscapes for People, Food and Nature Initiative to ensure that those actions were being implemented in some fashion or another. So our role at the Landscapes for People, Food and Nature Initiative was to coordinate collaboration amongst our partners and the world at large to advance those action items. One subset of those action items is specifically related to financing sustainable land and water management in Africa. So today we're going to focus on what those action items were. And I'll say that in 2017, what happened earlier this year was that we got together again in Nairobi, or this time in Addis Ababa in March, and with about 140 practitioners from across Africa, updated the plan. So we just sort of took stock. Many but not all of the people were the same from 2014 to 2017. We sort of took stock of what's happened so far in the 3 years. The LPFN reported what we knew, and some people surprised us with some stuff that they said had happened that we didn't know about. And we also said, okay, so what still needs to happen? Where are the gaps that we haven't been able to fill yet? Where does the collaborative energy really need to go going forward? And what came out of that, among other things, was an update to the plan. So there's an African Landscapes Action Plan Phase 2. You can find it on Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature Initiative's website, which is at peoplefoodandnature.org. I'll pass back this, which is just a 2-page brief about the update to the plan. And then the key thing, again, for today is that the finance section of the plan was one of the places where there had been a lot of energy, but not a ton of progress. So you might say here in Germany, Sturm und Drang, about finance, but not a lot of movement. And so one of the key things that people identified as something that could help generate some of the movement we need to see is a specific finance learning community for investors in African landscapes. And that's what Carolyn is going to talk about today, the launch of that and how we move that forward for the investor community in Africa, starting right here. So some of the other things that are in this finance piece are are things that an investor community of practice that is sharing learning within and among each other can really help advance things like increased coordination of investments, innovation in financial mechanisms, all kinds of stuff that if financial institutions are collaborating pre-competitively to advance the practice of investing in landscapes in Africa, we can really start to see a lot of actual action there. So with that, and without further ado, I'll let Carolyn Van Leenders tell you specifically about what she's envisioning for a financial community of practice, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and comments, and I think she's got some questions prepared that we can all have a discussion about. So after you finish chewing, we'll give you we'll give you a chance to talk to us.
Thank you very much. Well, take your time for chewing. I will take the time to tell you a little bit about the concept of a community of practice. My name is Caroline van Leenders. I've been working for the Dutch government for 20 years now, and my specialty is bringing people together so that they can learn from each other. I made a community of practice in the Netherlands, financial institutions and natural capital. I'll tell you a little bit about it. I helped the European Commission to set up a community of practice. I will tell you a little bit about that one as well. And then I was in Addis Ababa in the spring this year, and I learned that there's there are some financial institutions struggling with investing in landscapes, and I came up with the idea, why not see if there's appetite for a community of practice in Africa on investing in landscapes. But first, some background about what a community is, how it works, and what it delivers. The idea of a community of practice is that it accelerates change. I work from a very special theory of change, which is called transition management. And in that theory, you see that there's different phases for change. You have a pre-development phase where there are front runners, but they're really underground and they are not really connected to each other. There's a second phase, what we call takeoff. There's the first best practices, the front runners are moving more, there is the first coalitions being built. Then there's a third phase, acceleration, and that's where you get standardization, new things are brought into regulation and into all kind of policies. And in the fourth phase, stabilization, the new is the norm. A community of practice is an instrument that we use in the second phase of transition, in the phase where there is practice, but the front runners are still struggling. And if you bring them together, they make more mass, they make more, they share different methods so that you can prepare for the third phase where you need standardization. So community of practice is a very special instrument for a very special phase of transition. A community of practice is about people. I'm looking for 15 people. Why 15? If I have 10 people and some don't show up, I have too little in the group. If I have 20 people and they all show up, I have too many. So 15 is the number. 15 people from different financial institutions. These are 15 people that maybe they're not all there. They're from banks, pension fund, crowdfunder, institutional investor, impact investors, insurance companies, so people from different kind of financial institutions. What these people share is that they want to make their balance sheet green. All the portfolio of their institution, that was their longing, all struggling. Bringing them together in total 10 times, a whole day, every 3 months. After 10 times, class is over. The government won't support the network any longer. If you want to stay together as a group, fine, but not with money of the government. It's a bit like nudging. So, 10 times, a whole day, every 3 months, means that after 2.5 years, you're done. The special thing about the community is that I am very strict about the process, but they are in control on the content. So they can say what they want the meetings to be about. They set the agenda of the different meetings, and I do all the work I can to make it a very special and good meeting, because I don't pay them for showing up. So if it's not a very good meeting, they won't come back. So there's a lot of responsibility for the moderators, which is good. So how does it work? What did they learn? Why is finance so interesting from the point of ecosystem services, environment, biodiversity? You know, this is the way finance usually is looked at. You have financial institutions, they invest in sectors. Sectors have an impact on the ecosystem, but they're also dependent on it. And so there's a risk and return going up. This is the normal way of looking at things, but so, with that in mind, that was our start. That was the start paradigm that the community began with. Then we had all kind of different meetings, and this is a kind of summarization of some of the content that happened. Natural capital is about climate change, of course. It's about water. And it's about land. If you know your impact in these 3 topics, you have 80% of your impact on natural capital covered as a financial institution. So we had dedicated meetings on these 3 topics. A meeting on climate change. It was about divesting. Should you divest from fossil fuels and invest in renewables? Or should you engage with companies like Shell? Why is Shell moving at the moment? Why are they setting targets on CO2? Because the institutional investors are pushing for less climate. They don't want to have as much CO2 emitted with their portfolio, so they have to start to engage with companies to bring down CO2 emissions. So climate is about investing or engaging. Water, the next topic in the community, a very difficult topic because it's more localized, it's more context sensitive. We have now the first member of the community that has set out to be water neutral in 2030. They have 54 billion euro under management, so 50 billion euro become climate neutral in 2030. They have no idea how to do it. But if you set an ambition and you reach out to the Water Footprint Network, to scientists, to NGOs, then you might have a way to learn how to do it. They're now in the process of making a water impact measurement agenda, and they need help. So water, more difficult, but most difficult, land, and especially biodiversity. Within the community, some were thinking about how can we not be related to deforestation, how can we invest in conservation, how can we make an indicator for biodiversity, but that topic was still very underdeveloped and very new to them. At the end of during the whole community, which took 2.5 years, it slowly showed that maybe we need a paradigm shift, because if you want to keep ecosystems resilient, then you have to take them as a starting point. So you have to kind of something happening. Maybe something is going down. Hi. Okay. you should turn it upside down. You should take the ecosystems as your starting point. And if you take the ecosystems as a starting point and you put the financial institutions at the bottom, you get a completely upside down way of thinking for them. It's not about having impact, it's also about being dependent. And more they started to realize that if you, for example, invest in Heineken, but Heineken is in a very dry area, you might have stranded assets and not get your return back because you're not taking care of the ecosystems that provide the water. So there was this change in paradigm within the community that they all started to share. This change in paradigm meant that they were thinking about new partners. You might have to work together with very different partners to keep the ecosystems resilient. It was about thinking about risk. Is it only about financial risk? Or how can you incorporate ecological risks within your risk models? Very difficult. It was about one planet thinking. You know, we have only one planet. What does this mean for an institutional investor to start to try to incorporate that in your decision making? And it was about all kind of new ways of collaboration. Okay, but the elephant in the room, biodiversity, was not really solved within the community. There was too little time, it was too early. And then the European Commission said, DG Environment, we have a platform, business and biodiversity. We have difficulty reaching out to financial institutions. Can you help us to set up a community of practice on finance and biodiversity? Be my guest, I said, of course. So it took us some time to find 15 people again of different financial institutions within the European Commission, European Union, and we also needed a bank from Greece and an investor from Italy on biodiversity. But we found 15 people, so the Community of Practice Finance and Biodiversity has met this year 4 times. We'll meet again 4 times next year on biodiversity. They are talking about, can you make an impact indicator for biodiversity? There are now 2 banks in Europe that have an impact indicator for biodiversity with all their funds. And if you have an impact indicator, you can also start to think about becoming biodiversity neutral as a financial institution, which at the end will mean that you have to compensate for damage done. So it will mean that you have to invest in conservation and in restoration. Hey, here the landscape thinking is slowly coming on the agenda. So that community is now on the way. And then, can we make a new one again? Can we do the trick for Africa? And wouldn't it be great to have one in Africa, more on landscape, water, climate and food in landscape as an idea? And would that be interesting to have a kind of a mirror community in Europe and a community in Africa? So this time the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands said, if you find 15 people from different financial institutions in Africa that want to be part of this community, we will give you budget for running it. So, here we go again. So, what are my questions? Together with Mirjam van Gool, I have been working on this idea, and we have a scoping memo now, and we have a few things we need. Do we do the whole of Africa? Do we do part of Africa? What part of Africa? What are countries with really interesting practice? Because I need practice. I need financial companies that did their first investment in practice and are struggling. Second, who can be the host? In the Netherlands, the host was the Dutch government. In Europe, it's the European Commission. What is a good host in Africa? What is interesting for financials to relate to? Because at the end of the day, you don't only want 15 people being empowered, or maybe an e-book written by me and others, but you want system change. You want to connect it to the regulators. You want to connect it to the Ministry of Finance. So you want to connect it to all kinds of system players. What is a clever host? What would be the content of this community? Landscape broad? Do we do landscape and water? Do we do landscape and climate? What is a good content also in the name? Positioning it in the right way. And where do I find the 15 members? Well, this is a little bit my quest for 2018. I need all the help I can get, so I'm really glad that you're here. And I would really like to see if we can have time to maybe discuss some of these questions and give you the floor for questions for me.
Hello. Well, first of all, this is fascinating. Two quick questions. Is this a methodology that was developed by the Dutch, like for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? That's the first question. And the second one is, for these indicators that you're trying to develop, are you trying to align to other efforts, for example, the SDGs or other international commitments, and trying to see, how is the financial community addressing these goals and indicators? Just that.
Well, the idea of such network learning was developed in the Netherlands, probably because we are the kind of country where we all do stakeholder engagement since, we got our feet dry. So it's in our genes and in our history. So that might be a reason. And the transition theory that I mentioned is also kind of Dutch. Of course, I try to link to anything that progresses this transition, whether it's be the SDGs, but also, for example, the work on the biodiversity indicator that I mentioned. We relate that to the work of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Learning, to the UN Commission on Biodiversity Impact Investing. So, I'm trying to link it to, because we only do one day on such a subject. So it's only one day of sharing, learning among each other. But of course, there's a big world out there with a lot of knowledge. So how can we make progress by clever connecting and in that way progressing?
Hi, my name is Gerhard Savnay from Tropenbos. I have a question. You say, well, you are asking now for the 15 members. I don't know how many you have already, but I was thinking maybe the counterparts of the banks or institutions you are working with already in the European Union and in the Netherlands, is that not an entry also to connect these networks somehow?
Very good observation. Of course, I mean, it's end-end. We have reached out to FMO and asked FMO what are your clients in different African countries that you really champion as being innovative and front runners. We have reached out to Conservation Capital, which is a capital investor in Europe, but also on Rewilding Europe, which is a project where they bring wild animals back in Europe in different places, and they also have projects in Africa. So I'm using some of those relationships, but building a community is a lot about people. So I'm using the relationships I already have, but they are not enough to find the 15. So that's why I have to find other ways as well. We are now in good talks with the IFC, who of course have a lot of different relationships. Yesterday we met somebody of the Rabobank who said, "Oh, that's not a problem finding 15 people." I thought, okay, beautiful, come on. So it's and because you do ask something of people that are already very busy, having a very busy agenda, and you ask them for something that is a bit unlike the normal projects that they step into, because with the community you don't know what comes out of it, and there's only something coming out of it if you put something in it. If they don't put any energy in it, they have to do homework. We visit sites. I want to know. I write best practices. So if they put energy in the community, then it will bring about a lot. But if they don't do anything, nothing will happen. So it is not easy to find 15 people that are willing to give it a try. Oh yeah, FAO. FAO has an online community on landscape, so maybe we can leverage and connect to them and be like they do the online part and we do the more real life part. Yeah.
No, I have a question related to the first one, the regional scope. But maybe that it also comes with a question to you. Like, was it very much different to do this in the Netherlands than to do that in Europe? And let me explain why I asked you that question, is that in much of our work, I see that people who are working in a similar context helps actually to have that learning experience. So for us, for example, if I bring together people from the same region, which have more in common, then I take them from all over the world, living in very different contexts, then sometimes it's much more difficult. So extending that argument, I would suggest, or I would think that perhaps bringing people from all the corners in Europe together makes this kind of cross-learning a little bit more difficult than if they all come from the Netherlands. If that is the case, then maybe you should not look for people all over Africa, but concentrate on West Africa, next time East Africa, something like that. But maybe this subject is different.
There's a yes and no. I completely agree. Also, by the way, for practical reasons, by traveling, for example, to just, and costs and stuff like that, and you have to sleep over if you do a field trip as well. So there's the practical side of it. And there's also the context. But what is interesting is diversity is also very interesting for learning, because finding out that you're all in a different context but all in the same situation kinds of is binding as well, if you moderate it in a good way. So, but I think that there's an optimalization, that if the differences are too big, for example, in the European community, we couldn't find people from East European financial institutions. So Greece, yes. From Spain, yes. So it's not only the northern part of Europe, but the eastern part of Europe. They were thinking, biodiversity, you must be kidding. I mean, our financial institutions they don't even grasp climate, so they haven't even got the first little baby steps made. So there is this optimum which can hold a lot of diversity, but then it goes down again. Yeah.
In that regard, am I jumping ahead? I was actually thinking the same thing for the regional focus. I think there's already a lot of diversity in the regions you mentioned. West Africa has quite a lot of different countries and already different languages. But I would also focus on different kind of banks. I mean, rural banks in Africa are very different. You've got these Susu lending systems in Ghana that you don't have in Nigeria. And you've got the high street banks, or sometimes even governmental investment committees like in Ethiopia that play a very important role. I think if you would bring those together, that would actually be very, very interesting and get something done.
We are now thinking probably as a regional focus around like Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, a bit that part. We do know some really interesting practice in countries like Ghana and Nigeria, but we can always bring them in as a guest speaker, or we can always find a way to bring really interesting practice within the network, but maybe make it more in that region. And I do agree that what is so much fun in such a community is if you have very small players and very big players, if you have like more government related and really, really, really hard private, if you have more related to charity and family offices compared to real institutional investors, because we found that if they then understand that they're all in the same boat, that is really making the group stronger, and you get a really interesting lobby to the regulators, because if a group of 15 people is knocking on your door and they're all very different but they're all struggling with the same, then there must be something systemic going on. If it's all banks or if it's all this so diversity is key for them, but also for the message to the bigger network. So we can hold a lot of diversity in that respect, I found until now. And we can hold some diversity in countries, but maybe I don't know, Northern Africa and the rest of whole Africa, and then the whole diversity of financial institutions, and then on almost everything of sustainability, all the SDGs. I think we don't have 10 meetings, and then the group does not become a group, So because it's part about people work, it's all about people. A lot. All these people are lonely. So you want empowerment, and so group forming is a really important part of. After 10 times, this is I did another community in the Netherlands as well that was not in finance. After 10 times, the group says, "Oh no, why are we stopping now? It's just becoming to be fun. So it takes a long time for a group to really be a strong group. And yeah.
So it's a similar suggestion, really, to maybe break it up somehow by region or by sector, and that possibly if you could reach investors who are already exposed to quite serious risk, so risks relate to reputation, environment, land rights conflict, etc. So if you looked, I don't know, oil palm and cocoa in West Africa or the Central African Basin, then there must already be a community of investors and other practitioners as well, and conservation and on the development side, who are interested in getting sustainable finance in. So, but then there's an issue perhaps about the scope. You're talking about landscapes. So some of the suggestions that came up, there may be lending agencies in Africa who are interested in, building capacity in particular value chains, or they might be interested in smallholder empowerment. And then there's an issue we were discussing this morning, which is land rights, which is a serious risk for anyone wanting to make a sustainable business investment or do landscape restoration in Africa. So my feeling is like targeting somehow on particular regions and the communities that are involved, although I can see you might end up having to target multiple communities of practice here, which would make your job even more difficult.
Well, if I get one going, I'm really happy. And maybe if other ones want to copy, be my guest. I mean, this is not like a very difficult kind of work. It's about dedication, passion, and some tricks. But it's not like real difficult work. So if other want, I met somebody who said, "Can you come and do one in Asia? Can you?" Well, I mean, everybody can do one. Of course, I've written about it. So that's. But what you said is, I think, completely true. Also, what is also interesting about the community is to see whether you can find financials that are more in there for risk and reputation and stuff like that. But there's also financials that are in there because of opportunity. And if you have a community where you have both, then the ones that are really only thinking about risk, they will become more and more interested to see how they can turn risk into opportunity. And at the end of the day, that's of course what we need. Because if you think of it about opportunity, it's much more easy to bring it to the CEO, to bring it to your colleagues, because a lot of times this work is also about how to get my colleagues involved in this kind of thinking, how to get my CEO involved in this kind of thinking, how to bring it to the clients, which is easier if you talk from an opportunity point of view than if you talk from a risk point of view. So risk is great, and it's good to get them in. I mean, I don't give a shit how to get them in, as long as they're in. I'm sure something nice will happen. But you do need also financials that are in there because they are value driven and because they're driven by a positive agenda. That's really important. Otherwise, before you know it, you're only talking about accounting risks and nothing happens, and all risks are mitigated to others. So you do need the positive ones in there as well.
Hi. I wonder about defining it as investing in landscapes, because whether everyone, the people you might attract, would actually see themselves as investing in landscapes. We've spoken about cocoa, rubber. They might see themselves as investing in a component of the value chain, which will be highly relevant to a landscape, but they might not see that. So I think framing, is one thing.
Well, you're completely right, and that it's a bit like a thin line, because on one hand you don't want them to only come with investing in water utilities without the question, is there going to be water the coming 5 years or within 5 years? So you want the broader landscape approach as being part of the work, but you don't want to scare them off by putting it in the name. So that's a bit of, we don't have an answer. I mean, we talked about it also with, of course, the people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the people of agriculture in the Netherlands who are, going to, if everything goes right, are going to pay for the community. But this is exactly, you want them in with the right mind, but you don't want to scare them off to make it too exotic to them, to say it is such a, so that's, no answer, but
It feels to me a little bit like it would work from the risk perspective if people could appreciate, investing in a way that's lower risk or taking account of future risks. Maybe that's a way to connect into the landscape. So the landscape approach is a response to that.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, what came to my mind also is that I think in May there will be a global landscape investment forum, I think in London or so. So that might be a good opportunity maybe to pitch this again. And there you have potential clients.
And the best thing would be to already have 2 or 3 financials that say if you are the first, and that's why we did it it's a bit like in the Dutch we have a saying which is zwaan kleef aan, if you have one then the rest will come, kind of idea. If we have 1 or 2 that are already saying we are the ones that have taken an initiative, I want to give them all the credit, the first 2 or 3 that say we are in, because then to pitch on such places, if you already have 2 or 3, then the rest is easier. And if you're there from the start, that's also how we did it in the European version. If you're there from the start, you obviously have more input on these kind of questions of scoping and regional. So it's sensible to be there as one of the first. And for us, it's more easier to go to, thanks for the tip, to that kind of conferences. Yeah, so if I have the first 3, it would make my life a lot easier. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. First, because we are talking about this financing in the context of this action plan. And if I read it, one of the first things is to map existing financial flows and resources. Because I see the questions are very much related to that topic. So I'm wondering whether you have done that, this mapping of stakeholders or the financial resources. So that's the first question. And the second one, I'm wondering, I understand that you want to create African-based community of practice, but we also know that in Africa, some foreign countries invest quite a bit. I'm Chinese, so I know how much my country invests in that continent. So I'm just wondering, what is your strategy in terms of addressing these outside investors, which has a major role to play?
Great questions. On the first one, the first question on mapping, it has a little background to it. When we were in Addis Ababa at this update of the African Landscape Plan, it struck me that a lot of people, if they start to work on landscape initiatives, they take a lot of time to map natural resources within a landscape. People usually also take a lot of time to map the social side in a landscape, like communities, governance, stuff like that. But people hardly ever do financial mapping of a landscape. I've been now looking for consultants. There are almost no consultants who can do a financial mapping of a landscape. The normal question, who is making money out of your landscape? Where are the returns of the landscape? On whose balance sheet are they ending? They always know about public funds, but hardly ever about private funds. So in Addis Ababa, we said to people, if you work on landscape initiatives, you should do financial mapping as well as the other ways of mapping. And the IUCN presented here yesterday a tool how you can do that as a landscape initiative, how you can do financial mapping for your landscape. For the situation, for making the community of practice, I am much more a people person. So I try to make a community by people knowing people. But I work together with Mirjam van Gol, and she's much more also of financial mapping. So she is now in the process of making a list of all the banks, trying to find out how they are investing. So we are trying to work from both sides. She more from the mapping kind of side and see who's interesting. And me, from the personal kind of networking side. And then hopefully this is also, I think, complementary and also necessary that you do both. So we try to be a bit complementary in that. So yes, that's. And the foreign. I would love to have a few foreign ones in the community. Actually, I would really love a Chinese, a Malaysian, but also could also be from America. Also, that is key. I mean, I think it would be of utmost relevance for financials that are African, based in Africa, to be in contact with this kind of financial. At the end of the day, we're all, just one slide that I didn't show. This is one slide that I really like always to end with. I said we are in the third phase of thinking about our planet. First it was flat, then it was round, and now it's one. At the end of the day, it's only one planet. So, I mean, I'm sure that in this age, cooperation is necessary, and also financial cooperation. So in that respect, I would love to have one or two, not too many. I don't want to dominate, the group, but maybe 2 or 3 foreign ones. Yeah, high on my wish list.
I really like that last question. I mean, in Indonesia, where I'm from, we have a huge problem because it's actually the local banks that have no commitments post legal regulatory compliance, and sometimes not even that actually are funding a lot of the small and medium palm oil companies that are then causing a huge impact rather than the large companies. But what we found is that actually the international banks are still linked to those national banks as well, via sort of all sorts of networks. But they need to be at the table, those national banks. I also really like your point about turning this into an opportunity, because what we found in our work is that the banks are not able to access a whole huge list of clients, because those clients are not complying with particular sustainability standards. And if you can actually work with those clients to then make them, in fact, kind of financeable through getting them on a roadmap of improving those standards, the bank wins because they get the business and they get the extra clients, and you actually win because the company on the ground is doing better. My last point on your last question with regards to the 15, maybe it's related a little bit to to my last point. Again, we have found that working with the different departments within the bank is really, really important. So not just investment banking, but also with private banking. In many cases, the bank will look at its sustainability commitments from the investment side, because that's funding companies, but they will ignore it on the private banking, which is actually funding the same, it might be funding the same individuals that actually own the palm oil companies, but those individuals might have investments in palm oil companies which are totally separated from what they have as a sustainable business, but actually they also have other businesses on the side. So I would really recommend that there are different departments in those 15 members, not just different companies.
Yeah, but it's also, for example, there's an institutional investor in the European community that is not investing in sovereign bonds of countries if they don't have a good biodiversity policy, which is really interesting because it's a French investor, Peter Groove de Cam. They are based in Paris. They don't invest in France sovereign bonds because of nuclear energy. And then they get really angry letters from the Dutch, from the French government saying, "Hey, how come you're not investing in your own country?" So a lot of people think that this is only about investing in companies, but the finance of investors can be much bigger than only companies. It's also about countries. It's about mortgages. It's about real estate. There's this whole spectrum of investments that all need to be in the picture, and companies is only a small portion of it. But to take on your point that private and more general parts of those, but what we always try to do is I'll take anybody who comes on board, but because they will know what other parts of their financial institution needs to be involved, and it's always one of the meetings of a community is always about how to get my colleagues interested. And that's also something that they give each other tips and they share and they visit each other's CEOs, stuff like that, because it's usually they're lonely in one part somewhere in their institution, and it's usually people with a heart for this subject, and they have to try to get the rest on board. But your point is taken. Thank you very much. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. So if there's no more questions, yeah. Oh, Miriam has a question for the group. Please stand up, Miriam.
Hello, everyone. There were a couple of very good questions and suggestions, but also gave me the idea that some of you know some of these banks that might be interested. So can I ask each and every one of you to approach either Caroline or myself and just give some names of banks that you think might be interested, or someone you think who knows someone who, etc., because it's just very helpful. And I know there is a wealth in this community of thoughts about it, so please approach us with that.
Yeah, we'll remember you for it. We will say later, you remember that guy that came, or that woman that came up to us and just gave us the greatest tip? That's how it all started. It's not that we have nothing, but yeah.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, and thank you, everyone, for your contributions. That's to be really great, and I think we'll make sure we report from the Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature initiative side also sort of the progress of this. So stay tuned there at peoplefoodnature.org for updates just in general about the African Landscapes Action Plan and specifically about the development of this community of practice. So thank you very much. And right now we're going to show some films, brief, short films, and have a couple representatives of those movies. So if you're interested, if you don't have anywhere to go and you want to stay and watch some films, that's coming up next.